Well, welcome to the second lecture. I have copies of last week's lecture, which will be available after this one. Last week's lecture is already viewable if you click onto the Beechief Abbey Congregation website, and congratulate Nigel for doing a super job last week in videoing it. So, the kingship of God in the Old Testament. One of the surprising things about today's world is the attention that we pay to our leaders, the hopes that we invest in them. Who is going to be the new Prime Minister of Italy or Spain or Greece? Ask the newspapers and news programs. Who will be the next leader of the Liberal Democrats, we wonder? Who will be the next British Prime Minister? With a change of government and leader come new hopes for the future. Certainly the leaders themselves try to give the impression, especially when in opposition, that if they came to power, they would radically improve the conditions of the country. Now, if we in today's world place such hopes in our political leaders, it should come as no surprise that in the ancient world, similar hopes were placed in kings and rulers, sometimes to the extent that some of them were considered to be divine or claimed themselves to be divine. In 1948, Henry Frankfurt published a massive study of the ideas of kingship in the ancient world under the title Kingship and the Gods. This was a massive survey of material from ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia, covering all aspects of kingship and how kings were believed to integrate society and the natural world into one sacred whole. An epilogue entitled The Hebrews shrewdly observed some fundamental differences between the ancient Israelite concept of kingship and that which obtained in the ancient Near East, to the point where Frankfurt wrote that kingship for the Hebrews, quote, has no place in a study of ancient Near Eastern religion as an integration of society and nature, end of quote. However, this warning did not prevent Old Testament scholars from using material from the from the ancient Near East, to reconstruct rituals that were said to have taken place in the temple in Jerusalem and in which the king played a central role. Psalm 2 in particular was said to be a coronation psalm in which, at a crucial point in the ceremony, the king was handed a scroll by a priest or other official in which he read his mandate from God. "Thou art my son, this day have I begotten thee." This meant that the king had become the adopted son of God and stood in a special position, mediating between the people of God and ensuring that God's just rule was exercised over the people. Now, it would be easy to conclude from this that when the writers of the Old Testament spoke of the kingship of God, they were merely projecting human ideas of rulership onto a divine being who was created more or less in the human image. The remarkable thing about the Old Testament, in fact, is that it came to regard all its kings as fundamentally flawed human beings who could certainly not serve as pointers to God's kingship, and whose failures only generated longings for an ideal divine rule and an ideal kingdom whose achievement was beyond the capacity of the human race. This is clearly demonstrated by the person of the greatest king in the Old Testament, David. In 1 Samuel 13:14, David is described as a man after God's own heart. And in various parts of the Old Testament, there is the hope of the coming of a reborn David to rule his people. Yet in 2 Samuel, chapters 11 to 20, David is spared nothing as the story is told of how he committed adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of one of his soldiers, Uriah, who was on the battlefield, and made her pregnant, how he recalled that soldier back to Jerusalem in the hope that he would sleep with his wife so that the child in her womb would be thought to be his and not David's. How, when Uriah declined to sleep with his wife, David sent him back to the scene of the battle with instructions to his commander-in-chief to place Uriah in the front line of battle so that he would be killed. And when David heard the news of Uriah's death, he sent for Bathsheba and took her into his household as his wife. At this point, Nathan the prophet comes to David to denounce his behavior in the name of God, and David repents. Yet, this is only the beginning of David's troubles. His son Amnon rapes a half-sister named Tamar, and Tamar's full brother Absalom revenges Tamar by having Amnon killed. Absalom next leads a rebellion against David, which succeeds to the point that David has to flee from Jerusalem and take refuge across the Jordan, where Absalom is killed after he gets entangled in a great oak tree. You may remember the story. He only cuts his hair once a year, and so he has a lot of hair, and that's how he gets caught and stuck in the great oak tree. And there's a lovely story of him caught by his hair, sort of hanging between earth and heaven and swinging there. I don't fall to temptation to such problems. There is then another rebellion, this time led by a disaffected member of the family of Saul, David's predecessor of king. In the closing chapter of 2 Samuel, chapter 24, David holds a census of the people, an act which he then realizes is a sin. In order to pay for that sin, a prophet, Gad, offers David 3 choices: that there should be 3 years of famine, or that he should flee from his enemies for 3 months, or that a pestilence should ravage his people for 3 days. David chooses the pestilence, and 70,000 people die. This is not a flattering picture of an ideal king, a man after God's own heart, and the pattern for a future hoped-for ruler. And for centuries, the church tried to avoid the implications of the biblical picture of David by distinguishing between what he did as a private person, which was dreadful, and what he did in his office as a king, which was perfect. But this strategy could not hold out forever. And in 1697, Pierre Bayle published an article on David in his great dictionary, which did not hesitate to rehearse David's faults critically, on the grounds that they were publicly recorded in the Bible for any reader to see. In fact, the church had misunderstood the intentions of the biblical writers. The biblical writers were under no compulsion to record David's misdeeds. They could easily have omitted them if they had really wanted to present David only as a paragon of virtue. That they presented David warts and all, as we would say, was for a reason. And that reason was to indicate that the man after God's own heart was a flawed human being whose life could not be projected into the divine sphere so as to express the kingship of God. The biblical writers were saying, "Put not your trust in princes, nor in any child of man, for there is no hope in them," to quote Psalm 146, verse 3. This critical view of David and his flaws was carried over into the editing of the book of Psalms. The tradition that David composed many of the Psalms was part of this appraisal of him, where, when we read the Psalms attributed to David, we get a picture of a humble man of faith, surrounded by his enemies and beset by personal difficulties which make him call upon God for deliverance. Most famously, the title of Psalm 51, that most eloquent psalm of contrition and prayer for God's forgiveness, is linked with David's sin after he committed adultery with Bathsheba. This portrayal of David in the Psalms as the humble man in need of God's mercy, as opposed to him being some kind of superman who is the pattern for the kingship of God, opens the way for a new interpretation of the Psalms of the kingship of God. And I want to illustrate this from the most recent research on Psalm 2. I said above that it is possible to find in Psalm 2 traces of an ancient coronation ritual in which the king is declared to be the Son of God, that is, to be admitted to an office that carries particular responsibility for governing justly and wisely. However, in its present form, the psalm is concerned with the universal rule of God over all the nations. Zion and Jerusalem have a special place in this, but this is because it is Zion's and Jerusalem's God who is the Lord of the earth and its inhabitants. The psalm begins with an account of rebellion by the nations against God and his anointed king. Why do the nations conspire and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds asunder and cast their cords from us." The older commentators get into a real tangle, trying to suggest a time in Israel's history when Israel had control of an empire whose subject nations wished to throw off the yoke of subjection. There never was such a time. What is envisaged here is the desire of humanity, as represented by the nations, to refuse to be subject to God's kingship. The futility of trying to deny the ultimate assertion of God's sovereignty is now stated. He who sits in the heavens laughs. The Lord has them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. The next part of the psalm probably incorporates material from an ancient coronation ceremony in which the king is admitted to his office and is promised victory over his enemies. In the psalm's present form, this means that God's purposes revealed through his people Israel and represented by the king, will ultimately triumph. I will tell of the decree of the Lord. He said to me, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you. Ask of me, and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them with a rod of iron and dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel." The two final verses are addressed to the nations of the earth. "Now therefore, O kings, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear. With trembling, kiss his feet, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all those who take refuge in him." This psalm claims, then, that the God of what by any standards in the ancient world was a tiny, culturally backward, and politically insignificant nation is in fact the ruler of the world and its peoples, that his purposes have been disclosed to this insignificant people, and that his rule will one day be seen to be established in the world. This insight comes from complete disillusionment with earthly rulers and a willingness to present the country's most illustrious king as flawed and immoral. A similar transformation of ideas is seen in another strand of tradition in the Old Testament, that of the Day of the Lord. The Old Testament is full of stories in which the God of Israel acts on behalf of his people to defeat their enemies. At the crossing of the Red Sea, God destroys the armies of the Egyptians, allowing the Hebrews to escape. In Judges chapter 5, a hymn that celebrates an Israelite victory over a coalition of Canaanite kings, God is said to have swept Israel's enemies away by releasing a cloudburst onto the plain of Jezreel, which bogged down the chariots of the enemy. How far the cultural memory of the people had embellished these events we do not know, but it is likely that the cultural memory probably remembered these things rather in the way that we remember the Battle of Britain and the Spanish Armada and exaggerate the odds against us. It seems that in popular thought, therefore, the Day of the Lord was thought of as a time when God would act mightily on behalf of Israel and against her enemies. It must have been a great shock when the people heard the following words from the prophet Amos around the year 740 BC. "Woe to you who desire the day of the Lord! Why would you have the day of the Lord? It is darkness and not light, as if a man fled from a lion and a bear met him, or went into the house and leaned against his hand against the wall, and a serpent bit him. Is not the day of the Lord darkness and not light, and gloom with no brightness in it?" The idea that prophets, whose job it was to say good things about the nation and its rulers, should speak against the nation and threaten it with judgment from the God that was supposed to be its protector, was not very welcome, as we can imagine. And Amos became the first of a line of prophets of judgment, some of whom suffered abuse and threats against their life. They included Micah in the 8th century, and Jeremiah and Ezekiel in the 6th century. One of the most remarkable descriptions of the day of the Lord comes in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 12 to 22. For the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up and high, against all the cedars of Lebanon, lofty and lifted up, and against all the oaks of Bashan, against all the high mountains, and against all the lofty hills, against every high tower, and against every fortified wall, against all the ships of Tarshish, and against all the beautiful craft. And the haughtiness of man shall be humbled, and the pride of men shall be brought low, and the Lord alone will be exalted in that day, and the idols shall utterly pass away. And men shall enter the caves of the rocks and the holes of the ground from before the terror of the Lord and from the glory of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. In that day, men will cast forth their idols of silver and their idols of gold, which they made for themselves to worship, to the moles and to the bats, to enter the caverns of the rocks and the clefts of the cliffs, from before the terror of the Lord and from the glory of his majesty, when he rises to terrify the earth. Turn away from man, in whose nostrils is breath, for of what account is he? In this passage, the majesty of God is directed against all manifestations of human pride and pomp. The cedars of Lebanon and the oaks of Bashan were the mighty trees that made possible the building of palaces and temples. The ships of Tarshish were the blue riband trading ships that enabled precious metals and rare spices to be bought and sold by the rich and powerful. The lofty hills, high towers, and fortified walls were the fortified cities which protected the rich and powerful and from which they ruled. The idols of silver and gold represented the religion of human self-sufficiency, worshipping the fruit of human achievement. While none of these achievements were wrong in themselves, they tended towards a one-dimensional view of the self-sufficiency of the human race, with religion and the gods only recognized to the extent that they served human needs and made no moral demands. The prophetic message was a warning against such self-satisfaction and was particularly apt at times when natural disasters, such as earthquakes, disclosed how fragile the human domination of the natural world was. It is a message that we still need to heed as we wonder why houses built in floodplains or earthquake zones do not afford permanent and unshakable protection to those who live in them. Yet, the prophetic message of the kingship of God as expressed in the concept of the day of the Lord is not all gloom and doom. The book of Joel, which is dominated by the concept of the day of the Lord, sees the divine judgment as the prelude to divine blessing. The promise of blessing that follows the warnings of judgment ends with the famous passage about the outpouring of God's Spirit. And it shall come to pass afterward that I will pour out my Spirit on all flesh. Your sons and your daughters shall prophesy. Your old men shall dream dreams, and your young men shall see visions. Even upon the men servants and maid servants in those days, I will pour out my Spirit. This means that a reversal of the material fortunes of the people will be accompanied by spiritual blessings which will put into a new context the material conditions of the people. They will see their material blessings as divine gifts. They will not be tempted to practice that human pride and self-sufficiency that are so comforting for the powerful, but a curse to those who are the means to the power of the powerful. The benefits of God's kingship will be available to all, hence the mention of the men servants and the maid servants. Another remarkable witness to the kingship of God in the Old Testament is found in a group of psalms from Psalm 93 to 99. Several of them begin with the acclamation, "The Lord is King," according to the older translations, or "The Lord reigns" in the Revised Standard Version. An important emphasis in these psalms is that of social justice as the deeds of the inhumane rulers are described. They pour out their arrogant words. They boast all the evildoers. They crush thy people, O Lord, and afflict thy heritage. They slay the widows and the sojourner, and murder the fatherless, and they say, "The Lord does not see, the God of Jacob does not perceive." This same Psalm 94 also condemns the arrogant corruption of rulers who pass unjust laws in order to lend legality and respectability to their wickedness. Can wicked rulers be allied with thee, who frame mischief by statute? Or, as I translated this line in my book, The Psalms in Daily Life, can those who cover up their wickedness have you as an ally, those who produce evil by passing laws? Yet the part of these psalms that always impresses me most is where the coming judgment of God is seen as a blessing to the world of nature. Let the heavens be glad, and let the earth rejoice. Let the sea roar, and all that fills it. Let the field exult, and everything in it. Then shall all the trees of the wood sing for joy before the Lord, for he comes. For he comes to judge the earth. He will judge the earth with righteousness, and the peoples with his truth. Judgment here is good news. It is good news because it is God's righteous judgment, a judgment that will deliver the world from human cruelty to other humans and human cruelty to the world of nature. The day of the Lord will be bad news only to those who want to live in God's world without acknowledging that it is God's world. To those who have no regard to what is right and wrong and who treat their fellow human beings accordingly. It has been said that the anger of God in the Old Testament is not directed against the human race, but against those things that harm and disfigure the human race. The strongest vision of the kingship of God, as expressed in Old Testament hopes for a better world, comes in the well-known passage in Micah 4, which is also repeated in Isaiah chapter 2. It shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be raised up above the hills, and peoples shall flow to it. And many nations shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and we may go in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between many peoples, and shall decide for strong nations afar off. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more, but they shall sit, every man under his vine and under his fig tree, and none shall make them afraid, for the mouth of the Lord of hosts has spoken. It is interesting to compare this vision with the material in Psalm 2 that had been taken over from the ancient Israelite coronation ceremony. In Psalm 2, that material envisages that Zion's king will crush his enemies and break them in pieces. In this Micah vision, it is the nations themselves that will break in pieces their instruments of war. They will not band together against God as in Psalm 2. They will go willingly to Zion in order to hear the word of God and to learn his ways. The theme of the kingship of God has gained far more depth and breadth as time has gone on in the Old Testament. Before I end, I want to mention a complicated matter that will become crucial in the next 2 lectures. The texts that I have quoted refer to the future. But what is the future? We have to reckon with the fact that although time is measured scientifically, it is constructed and experienced socially. It was, after all, the invention of railways in the 19th century that made it necessary for Britain and other countries to adopt national and international standards of time, as opposed to the previous local standards, where the real time for a community was what the clock on the local church tower said it was. What was it like to live at a time and in a society where there were no clocks, no methods of time reckoning in terms of BC and AD, no long-term planning? In his book, Yesterday, Today and Tomorrow, Time and History in the Old Testament, Simon de Vries argues that, I quote, "The Hebrews were so intensely interested in the future because they knew they had a share in shaping it. Also because they believed their God was waiting on their action. Always the future that awaited them was predicated in terms that were calculated to influence their present behavior. If it was to be a day of woe, it was designed to move them to repentance and conversion. If it was to be a day of bliss, it was designed to move them out of despair. Thus, Israel's concern with the future was, if anything, eminently practical and personalistic. It involved the personhood of God and the personhood of man in free interaction, both of which were guaranteed because the future was not predetermined, but open to the loving, trusting partnership of God as history's purposeful shaper and man as history's responsible actor. End of quote. Now, in this quotation, I do not like the phrases the Hebrews and Israel, as though what is being said applied to every Israelite without exception. What de Vries says is true of certain Israelites, most notably the prophets, and that is all that matters for our purposes. The point is that when we read texts such as Micah 4, we should not think of them as referring to a future golden age that may never be realized in our world. We must see them as visions that both judge and inspire us in the present, and which give us the hope that in our openness to God and with His help, the future can be altered for the better. In the Old Testament, the kingship of God is not the arbitrary rule of a dictator who forces through his program against the will of the people he governs. The kingship of God is designed to move human hearts and wills to do what they see to be best for the human race and the world that it inhabits. That ends today's lecture, and next week the subject is the kingdom of God in the teaching and preaching of Jesus.